There are only 3 outcomes for Masters London. These 3 scenarios are going to determine who's going to be the Masters champion at the end of the day. Let's start with the first one. Let's jump right into it. And the first one is going to be the chaos theory. The chaos theory is basically the whole idea of the teams that are in the Switch stage, like Full Sense, GE, NRG, XLG, teams that are statistically the lowest odds. These are the teams that are in the Switch stage hoping to make a run and hopefully get hot going into Switch stage and into playoffs. They want to start off with a bang and then be able to carry that momentum. And because this game is all about momentum, this game is all about energy. If a team feels like they're shooting, they can pretty much beat anybody, because one of the top seeds can have a funky day, have an off day, and then next thing within a couple games they're out of the tournament. These are the chaos teams that are hoping to wreak havoc and pretty much shatter brackets. And I think this is probably the most possible theory, considering how the field of Valorant has been improving. I feel like the overall teams, there's a lot of parity. Within each Masters and each championships, there hasn't been a back-to-back champion. Nongshim was, probably the most hyped to be able to do back-to-back, but it didn't happen that way. They didn't even make it into Masters London. And so going into this seed, it's like, okay, we obviously have our favorites. There's no longer going to be a Fnatic. There's no longer going to be, even Energy. They're a 3rd seed. Most people are counting them out. They're hoping to be part of the chaos. They're hoping, get a win off of XLG, get a favorable draw into their next game, and be able to hit the ground running. Especially how they perform. Like, that's how they started within championships. Chaos, you want to shatter brackets, you want to shatter expectations, so that most people are afraid to go into you because you just are a streaking team. I believe in these teams. Lev, Full Sense, and GE are able to be part of the chaos and maybe make a top 4. I don't expect them to make top 2. I expect them to be able to make some damage in playoffs, get some upsets, maybe even in Switch stage later on. These are the chaos. These are what makes Valorant exciting. The unpredictableness. One team can be great, and then some of the favorites can drop out and not show up. And that brings to my second scenario, and that's the standard theory. That's G2 and Paper X. These are the favorites. We're all gonna have a great time going into Switch stage and get through that. Maybe Prim is gonna pop off. Maybe Lev do some spectacular stuff. But once it gets to playoffs, these 2 teams are on a closing course to be able to make it out and make it into grand finals. We're gonna have like, all these Switch stage teams that are gonna be able to beat G2 and Paper X, but in this scenario, that doesn't happen. G2 and Paper X are on a collision course, whether them meeting in the next game after the first match of playoffs, or meeting later on and down the line. Basically, the end goal is that G2 and Paper X make it down to the end of the line, and either one wins. These 2 are the favorites, and this is pretty much all to the theory. It's like the whole thing people were talking about with the last Masters. For Masters Santiago, everybody was talking about how, oh, I can't wait to play Nongshim. Oh, how's Nongshim gonna fare up? Because ever since they won out of Pacific, everybody was like, oh, Nongshim, everybody wants to play Danby. And as soon as Danby hit the stage and they played playoffs, they pretty much they pretty much won everything. They won every match, and the closest they got to was against G2. And that may be some foreshadowing. And the baton passed into G2 and say, hey, this is your turn now. Because that was probably the biggest thing. The biggest obstacle at Master Santiago was Danby and Nongshim. Now that Nongshim is out of the way, there's no more T1, there's no more Fnatic, there's no more of these like culturally big stellar teams that are like branded. There's no Sentinels, there is no big branded teams that are in playoffs automatically besides Paper X. That's probably their biggest obstacle for G2. And then Paper X, the same vice versa. G2 may show up on a day where something and the rest of the gang aren't hitting, and they just beat them. But again, this is the standard theory. This is probably like within the 40 to 30, maybe even 50% chance of actually occurring. And this leads to our last theory, and this is the EMEA scenario, where Vitality, Foot, maybe. Very low odds. Again, they could be part of the chaos scenario, but for this theory, we'll keep them in the EMEA scenario. And Team Heretics, Masters London, pretty much home ground for most of these players are like, within the general reason. EMEA makes it through playoffs and maybe even switch states for Vitality and wins the whole thing. These teams are comfortable. They find their own game and they're able to exploit teams that are generally having a bad read. These EMEA teams are going to approach the game to be able to outsmart and outmaneuver game plans and also at this point be able to outshoot. I feel like this is also this comes back to Team Heretics. Obviously, they're in playoffs, but it's hard to imagine a team that really relies on the Neon to be able to make it into top four. With Wu and Koshmaris being able to especially Wu, he can play Raze, he can probably play Jet. Jet was the thing that he was known for. If Wu picks up the Jet and Karshmaris maybe even picks up the Neon as a second entry, I think it's still possible, especially how Wu can op. I think it's just a matter of how they approach the game plan because I think tentatively their approach is a lot more aggressive. I think EMEA teams are understanding. EMEA teams are understanding that you need to be a lot more aggressive. I think it's just a matter about how they fare against the matchups like Paper X because Paper X has always been playing aggressive, so they understand the chaos. Any situation is rarely even new to them, and so that's why it's so hard to imagine. But I think it's it's Valorant is pretty much the game of any given day. Any given day, maybe even any given map. Like it's so crazy how great this game is at realizing that okay, if I have momentum, like I can just carry it. Like even like on games or series where they do reverse sweeps, they go from 2 maps gone to the other team and they go, okay, let's just win this map. That's how Fnatic was able to bring it back. They're able to bring it back to 5 maps, even though they're down 11-1. And it's just that semblance and that belief. If Team Heretics and these EMEA teams, okay, say, hey, sometimes we may not be able to outshoot them, but if we can outmaneuver them, then we can win. So yeah, these are my thoughts on the 3 scenarios. I think that Masters London is going to be so exciting because there's so much potential, so much new stars that are entering the scene. And I feel like it's a good look for Valorant when there's kind of like a new generation of players that are going into and potentially becoming champions. Obviously, I think my personal belief is that G2, it's their perfect time to be able to make it and finally get that championship. But with players that are on Lev and Full Sense that are like this new generation, I feel like it's a great time to be able to see like really flashy and mechanical gifted players that are at the peak of their level. And I think the best part is just like being able to see and be like, damn, I wish I could do that. I want to hop on a game on a ranked and do that. So yeah, I'll see you.